July 1943. The transport ship lurched through heavy Atlantic swells, and Hauptmann Friedrich Weber gripped the railing of the cargo hold, fighting the nausea that had plagued him for 6 days. Around him, 300 German prisoners of war sat or lay in the cramped space, their Afrika Korps uniforms still carrying the dust of Tunisia, where they had surrendered to American forces 3 months earlier. The ship's hold smelled of unwashed bodies, vomit, and the metallic tang of fear that no amount of military discipline could completely mask. Friedrich was 31 years old, a career officer who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1934 when Hitler's rearmament was just beginning. He had believed in the Führer's vision of German restoration, had absorbed the propaganda about Aryan superiority and the decadence of democratic societies. He had fought in Poland, in France, and finally in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had been ground down between Montgomery's 8th Army and American forces pushing from the west. Capture had felt like shame at first. German soldiers were taught that surrender was cowardice, that death was preferable to the dishonor of captivity. But after weeks in British holding camps and then transfer to American custody, Friedrich had begun to understand that survival itself was a form of resistance, that perhaps there would be a Germany to return to after this war ended, and that someone needed to live to see it. The propaganda about American treatment of prisoners had been consistent and terrifying. The Nazis had warned them that Americans were barbaric mongrels, a nation of racial inferiors and Jewish puppet masters who would show no mercy to captured Germans. Friedrich had been told to expect starvation, torture, forced labor under brutal conditions, possible execution. The uncertainty was almost worse than combat. At least in battle you knew what you faced. But captivity meant surrendering control, placing your life in the hands of an enemy who had been thoroughly demonized by years of propaganda. When the ship finally docked in Norfolk, Virginia, Friedrich was almost relieved. Whatever awaited them on land had to be better than the cramped, stinking misery of the transport. The prisoners were herded up onto the deck, blinking in the brilliant American sunlight, and what Friedrich saw stopped him completely. The port was enormous, larger than any he had seen in Europe. Cargo ships lined the docks as far as he could see, cranes lifting containers, trucks moving in organized chaos. But what struck him most was the abundance. Mountains of supplies sat stacked on the docks, crates marked with military insignia, barrels of fuel, pallets of food visible through open warehouse doors. This was a nation at war, supposedly stretched thin by fighting on 2 fronts, yet the sheer volume of material suggested resources that seemed almost unlimited. And the people. Dock workers moved with casual efficiency, many of them black Americans whose presence in positions of authority contradicted everything Friedrich had been taught about American racial hierarchies. Women drove forklifts and operated cranes, wearing work clothes and moving with the confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. No one looked hungry. No one looked defeated. These were people living in a country at war, but they looked nothing like the desperate, starving civilians Friedrich had seen across occupied Europe. "Unglaublich," muttered Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, standing beside Friedrich on the deck. Hoffmann was 26, a former Hitler Youth leader who had joined the SS before being transferred to regular Wehrmacht units in Africa. His ideological commitment had always been stronger than Friedrich's pragmatic careerism. "This cannot be real. It must be staged for our benefit." Friedrich wanted to agree, but the scale of what they were seeing made that explanation impossible. You could stage a scene for prisoners passing through, but you could not fabricate an entire functioning port with thousands of workers going about their business with no awareness they were being observed. This was real. This was simply how America operated. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks, American military vehicles that were newer and better maintained than most German equipment Friedrich had seen in the last year of the war. They drove through Virginia countryside, and again the abundance was overwhelming. Fields were cultivated and productive, Farmhouses looked well maintained. Gas stations had fuel. Stores had goods visible in their windows. This was not the desperate, rationed existence that German civilians were enduring under Allied bombing. This was a nation operating at nearly full capacity, despite being at war on 2 continents. Private Ernst Dietrich, a 19-year-old farm boy from Bavaria who had been conscripted in 1942, pressed his face to the truck's canvas opening, staring at everything they passed. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "They told us America was weak, that democracy had made them soft. But look at this. Look at all of this." Friedrich looked and understood with sinking certainty that much of what he had been told about the enemy was propaganda, deliberate distortion designed to maintain morale and ideological commitment. The question was, what else had been lies? Camp Clarksdale, Mississippi, became Friedrich's home for the next 3 years. The camp sprawled across former farmland, a city of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fence and watchtowers. It held nearly 5,000 German prisoners, mostly Afrika Korps veterans like Friedrich, along with some captured submariners and Luftwaffe crews shot down over North Africa. The first meal they were served should not have been revolutionary, but it was. Friedrich sat at a long wooden table in the mess hall, staring at the metal tray in front of him. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, coffee with real sugar, and a slice of apple pie. The portions were generous, more food than he had seen at a single meal in months. Around him, 300 men sat in stunned silence, confronting abundance they had not expected. "Es ist eine Falle," Klaus Hoffmann said quietly. "It's a trap. They fatten us up now, then starve us later. Psychological torture." But Lieutenant Hans Müller, a 40-year-old career officer who had fought in the First World War and had seen American POW camps before, shook his head slowly. "No. This is regulation. Geneva Convention requires captors to feed prisoners the same rations as their own troops. The Americans follow the rules." "The Americans follow rules?" Hoffman's voice dripped with skepticism. "While they bomb our cities? While they kill civilians?" Muller met his gaze steadily. "War is war, but this," he gestured at the food, "this is different. This is how they treat prisoners, and if they're feeding us like this, it means they have so much food that feeding 5,000 enemy soldiers doesn't even strain their supply system." Friedrich picked up his fork and took a bite of the meatloaf. It was good. Well seasoned, properly cooked, served hot. He ate slowly, watching his fellow prisoners wrestle with the same cognitive dissonance he felt. They had been told America was weak, decadent, barely able to feed its own population. Yet here was evidence of such abundance that they could feed enemy prisoners better than Germany was feeding its own troops. Ernst Dietrich ate with the focused intensity of a young man who had known real hunger. When he finished his tray, he looked up with tears in his eyes. "My family," he said quietly. "Back home. They're starving. The rations keep getting smaller. My mother's last letter said they were eating potato peels and dandelion greens. And here," he gestured helplessly at the empty tray, "here they feed prisoners pie." The silence that followed was profound. Because Ernst had voiced what they were all thinking. If America could afford to feed enemy prisoners this well, what did that say about Germany's chances of winning this war? What did it say about everything they had been told about American weakness? Friedrich finished his meal in silence, but his mind was working furiously. He had been trained to observe, to analyze tactical situations, to gather intelligence. And what he was observing here was not just abundance, but a fundamental difference in how societies organized themselves. Germany's war economy ran on ruthless efficiency, stripping resources from occupied territories, rationing everything for the front lines. But America seemed to operate on surplus, producing so much that feeding thousands of prisoners was barely noticeable in their overall logistics. After the meal, the prisoners were issued bedding, toiletries, and work clothes. The barracks were simple but adequate. Wooden bunks with real mattresses, heating stoves for winter, electric lights. Each prisoner received soap, a towel, a razor, toothpaste, toilet paper. Small things, perhaps. But these were luxuries that German soldiers in the field often went without. The camp commandant, Colonel James Whitmore, addressed them that evening through a translator. Whitmore was a career officer in his 50s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen combat but preferred order and regulation to chaos. "Gentlemen, you are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention," Whitmore said, his voice firm but not hostile. "You will be treated in accordance with international law. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will be paid for your labor, 80 cents per day in camp scrip that can be used at the canteen. You will have access to mail, to religious services, to educational programs. You will elect your own camp leadership and manage your internal affairs according to German military hierarchy." Friedrich listened carefully to the translation, trying to detect deception or mockery. But Whitmore's tone was straightforward, almost bureaucratic. These were simply the rules, and the Americans apparently intended to follow them. "You will also have access to newspapers and radio broadcasts," Whitmore continued. "We believe that informed prisoners make better prisoners. You will work on farms and in factories that support the war effort, but you will not be required to work on anything that directly contributes to combat operations, as required by the Geneva Convention. Any prisoner who refuses to work will forfeit his pay, but will not be otherwise punished beyond isolation. Any prisoner who attempts escape will be recaptured and disciplined, but not executed unless they threaten violence during the attempt." The contrast with German treatment of prisoners was stark. Friedrich had heard stories, rumors really, that everyone pretended not to believe, about how Soviet prisoners were treated in German camps. Starvation, exposure, casual execution. The official line was that Slavic prisoners were subhuman and not covered by international law. But sitting in this American camp, being told that German prisoners would be paid for their labor and given access to newspapers, Friedrich felt the first serious cracks forming in his ideological certainty. That night, lying on his bunk in the darkened barracks, Friedrich listened to the conversations around him. Some men clung desperately to their beliefs, explaining away the evidence as temporary or deceptive. Others were already questioning, already wondering what else they had been told that might be false. And a few, like Ernst Dietrich, simply wept quietly for the contrast between what they had found here and what their families were enduring at home. "Hauptmann?" Ernst's voice came softly from the bunk below. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Friedrich considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said finally, "but I don't know what home will look like when we get there." The next morning, work assignments began. Friedrich was assigned to a farm labor crew, along with 20 other prisoners and 2 American guards. They were trucked out to a cotton plantation 30 miles from the camp, where the owner, a weathered man in his 60s named Mr. Harold Dawson, regarded them with cautious curiosity. "Y'all speak English?" Dawson asked through the translator. A few prisoners indicated they had some understanding. Friedrich's English was basic but functional. He had studied it in school and had picked up more during the months in American custody. "All right then," Dawson said. "Here's how this works. Cotton needs picking. My regular workers got called up or moved to factories for defense jobs. You'll pick cotton same as anyone else. You work hard, I'll make sure you're treated fair. You slack off, I'll report it, and you lose pay. Simple as that." The work was hard. The Mississippi heat in July was crushing, worse than anything Friedrich had experienced in North Africa because of the humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. The cotton plants scratched exposed skin. The work was repetitive and back-breaking, bending, reaching, dragging the heavy canvas bags that grew heavier with every handful of cotton bolls. But two things struck Friedrich as he worked alongside his fellow prisoners in that vast cotton field. First, they were being treated like workers, not slaves. The guards watched to prevent escape, but did not harass or abuse them. When the water wagon came around mid-morning, they were given all they could drink. At noon, they were provided lunch, sandwiches, fruit, cookies, cold lemonade. The food was not as elaborate as the camp meals, but it was adequate and freely given. Second, they were working alongside civilians, Black Americans mostly, men and women who had not been called up for military service or who worked the farm in addition to other jobs. Friedrich watched them carefully, comparing what he saw to what he had been taught about American racial hierarchies. The propaganda had been clear. America was weak because of its racial mixing, because it allowed inferior races to exist alongside Aryans, because it had lost the purity that Germany sought to maintain. But the black workers Friedrich saw were not servile or degraded. They worked with skill and efficiency, often showing the German prisoners how to pick cotton more effectively, offering advice without condescension or hostility. They laughed and talked among themselves, took breaks when needed, complained about the heat and the work with the casual freedom of people who felt entitled to their own opinions. During the lunch break, an older black woman named Mabel sat down near Friedrich's group, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. She regarded the Germans with open curiosity. "Y'all really from Germany?" she asked. "Really fought for Hitler?" The translator conveyed the question. Friedrich nodded cautiously. Mabel shook her head slowly. "Long way from home. Must be strange being here, being prisoners." "It is strange," Friedrich admitted in halting English. "Different than we were told it would be." "What were you told?" Friedrich hesitated, then decided honesty was safest. "That we would be starved, tortured, that Americans were cruel to prisoners." Mabel laughed, a rich sound without mockery. "Honey, we got our own problems here in America. Lord knows we do. But we don't generally starve prisoners. That ain't how we operate." She paused, considering. "You know what the difference is between here and where you come from?" "Here, even when things ain't right, we can say so. I can sit here and tell you that there's plenty wrong with how black folks get treated in this country. I can say it out loud, and nobody's gonna haul me away for speaking truth. That's what democracy means, freedom to complain about what ain't working." The concept was so foreign to Friedrich's experience that he struggled to process it. In Germany, criticism of the regime meant the Gestapo, meant concentration camps, meant families denouncing each other out of fear. But this woman was casually explaining that American democracy was imperfect while simultaneously demonstrating the freedom that imperfection permitted. Klaus Hoffmann, who had been listening, spoke up in German. "She is lying, or she is a special case, brought here to deceive us." But Ernst Dietrich shook his head. How could they know we would have this conversation? How could they stage every civilian we encounter? There are too many of them, too many moments like this. Unless... He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Unless everything they had been told about America was fundamentally wrong. That evening, back at the camp, Friedrich lay on his bunk thinking about Mabel's words. Freedom to complain about what ain't working? In Germany, they had been taught that democracy was weak precisely because it allowed dissent, because it could not enforce the unity of purpose that totalitarianism demanded. But what if that dissent was not weakness, but strength? What if being able to identify and discuss problems openly was actually how societies improved themselves? The thought was dangerous, disloyal, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. Over the following weeks, the accumulation of small observations continued to erode Friedrich's certainty. At the camp canteen, where prisoners could spend their work scrip, the shelves were stocked with candy, cigarettes, soap, writing materials, even musical instruments. This was not a prison struggling to provide basics. This was a system with surplus to spare. The camp newspaper arrived weekly, not propaganda, but actual news translated into German. Reports about Allied advances were included alongside stories about labor strikes in American factories, congressional debates about war funding, even criticism of President Roosevelt's policies. Friedrich read these papers obsessively, trying to reconcile the image of a weak, divided democracy with the evidence of a nation powerful enough to fight on two fronts while still maintaining domestic freedoms. The camp elected its own leadership according to German military hierarchy, and the Americans allowed this internal governance to operate with minimal interference. Friedrich was elected as one of the camp representatives, responsible for mediating between prisoners and American authorities. In this role, he began to understand how American bureaucracy worked, slowly, often inefficiently, but with consistent adherence to rules and procedures that protected even enemy prisoners. When a prisoner became seriously ill, he was transferred to an American military hospital and treated by American doctors using medicine that was in short supply, even for civilian Germans. When mail arrived from home, heavily censored but real, it brought news of bombing raids and food shortages and growing desperation. The contrast between conditions in Germany and conditions in American captivity became impossible to ignore. One evening in late August, Lieutenant Müller called together a small group of officers, including Friedrich and several others he trusted. They met in a quiet corner of the barracks after lights out, speaking in whispers. "We need to discuss what we're seeing here," Müller said quietly. "Not what we're supposed to believe, but what we're actually observing. Because, gentlemen, I think we've been lied to, systematically, about everything." Klaus Hoffmann bristled immediately. "This is defeatist talk, Unterminierung of morale." "No," Friedrich said slowly. "This is facing reality. Look at what we've seen in just 6 weeks. The abundance, the organization, the freedoms these people have, the strength of their economy. Everything we were told about American weakness has been proven false. And if that was propaganda..." He let the sentence hang. "Then what else was propaganda?" Ernst finished. "Everything? The racial theories? The promises of German victory? The justifications for the war itself?" The question sat heavy in the humid Mississippi air. Around them, 300 men slept, but Friedrich felt suddenly, terribly awake. He thought about the cotton fields and the black workers who helped them freely. He thought about the newspapers criticizing the government without consequence. He thought about the meals and the medical care and the sheer overwhelming abundance of a nation that could fight a global war and still maintain civilian prosperity. "I don't know what else was false," Friedrich said finally. "But I know we need to start questioning. Because if we go home after this war, and I believe we will go home, we need to understand what we fought for and whether any of it was true." Müller nodded slowly. "Agreed. And we need to be careful. Some men will cling to the old beliefs no matter what evidence they see. Hoffmann is right that we must maintain morale and discipline. But among ourselves, in private, we need to face the truth of what we're experiencing." The group dispersed quietly, but something had shifted. A line had been crossed. The first open acknowledgement that everything they had built their lives around might have been a carefully constructed lie. Friedrich returned to his bunk, but sleep did not come easily. He stared at the wooden ceiling of the barracks, listening to the sounds of 5,000 German soldiers sleeping in enemy captivity, being fed and housed and treated according to rules that their own government had routinely violated. And he wondered what kind of Germany they would return to after this war ended. What kind of Germany they should return to. What kind of Germany they might help build if given the chance. Outside, the Mississippi night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant thunder. Inside, Friedrich Weber lay awake and felt the foundations of his worldview slowly, irrevocably cracking apart. The question was whether what replaced those beliefs would be better or worse than what came before, and whether he had the courage to find out. October 1943. The heat of Mississippi summer had given way to cooler autumn days, and Friedrich Weber found himself settling into a routine he never could have imagined 6 months earlier. Work in the cotton fields continued, though harvest season was ending. The camp had expanded its educational programs, English classes, vocational training, even a small library with books in German and English. The American authorities seemed genuinely committed to the idea that informed, educated prisoners were easier to manage than desperate, ignorant ones. But it was the small daily contradictions that continued to unsettle Friedrich's understanding of the world. Things that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a picture completely at odds with everything he had been taught. On a Tuesday morning in mid-October, Friedrich was assigned to a work detail at a nearby military supply depot. The job was simple: unloading trucks, organizing inventory, basic warehouse labor. 20 German prisoners worked alongside a dozen American soldiers and civilian contractors, supervised by a sergeant named Bobby Martinez, a Mexican-American from Texas, whose very existence contradicted Nazi racial theories. What struck Friedrich most was not the work itself, but the casual interactions. The American soldiers joked with the German prisoners, taught them English slang, shared cigarettes during breaks. There was no hatred, no cruelty, just the practical camaraderie of men doing boring work together. When one of the prisoners, a young corporal named Dieter, struggled with a heavy crate, Sergeant Martinez helped him lift it without comment or condescension. During the lunch break, Friedrich found himself sitting beside a black American corporal named James Washington, who was reading a newspaper while eating his sandwich. The headline was about labor strikes in Detroit defense factories. "Excuse me," Friedrich said in careful English. "May I ask question?" Washington looked up, surprised but not unfriendly. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "The newspaper. It says workers strike. Stop making weapons. During war. How is this allowed?" Washington considered the question, then folded the paper so Friedrich could see the article better. "It's complicated. The workers want better pay and conditions. Management says they can't afford it, so the workers refuse to work until they get a fair deal. It's their right. But the war effort, the production stops." "Yeah, it's a problem," Washington admitted. "Government's trying to mediate. Eventually, they'll reach a compromise. That's how democracy works. Everybody gets to fight for what they think is fair, even when it's inconvenient." Friedrich struggled with the concept. In Germany, if workers strike during war, they are shot. It is sabotage. Washington's expression grew serious. "Yeah, I've heard that. And see, that's the difference right there. Your government tells people what to do and shoots them if they refuse. Our government has to negotiate, has to convince people, has to make compromises. It's messier, slower, more frustrating. But the workers striking today will go back to work next week, and they'll do it willingly because they got heard, even if they didn't get everything they wanted." "This is weakness?" Friedrich asked, though he was no longer sure of the answer. "Maybe," Washington said with a slight smile. "Or maybe it's the only way to keep people fighting for something they actually believe in. Hard to make good tanks when the workers building them hate their government." The conversation stayed with Friedrich for days. He had been taught that democratic chaos was a fatal flaw, that only totalitarian unity could organize a nation for total war. But America was fighting on two continents, supplying its allies, maintaining civilian prosperity, and still allowing workers to strike for better wages. If this was weakness, it was the most powerful weakness Friedrich had ever witnessed. November brought new developments. The camp administration announced that prisoners could now receive packages from the American Red Cross, and that educational programs would be expanded to include discussion groups on political theory, history, and economics. The Americans called it reorientation, though they were careful to present it as optional enrichment rather than mandatory indoctrination. Klaus Hoffmann remained deeply suspicious. "It's psychological warfare," he insisted during one of the officers' informal meetings. "They're trying to break us down, make us doubt the fatherland. We must resist this corruption." But Ernst Dietrich, who had enrolled in every class offered, pushed back. "Resist what exactly? Learning English?" "Learning. Understanding how their economy works? Klaus, we're not children who need protection from ideas. If our beliefs are true, they should withstand examination. And if they're false..." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Friedrich found himself attending a weekly discussion group led by Dr. Howard Mitchell, a professor of political science from Ole Miss, who had been recruited to work with the prisoners. Mitchell was in his 50s, with graying hair and the patient manner of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. He approached the Germans not as enemies to be converted, but as intelligent men whose assumptions deserved serious examination. "Today we're going to discuss the concept of natural rights," Mitchell began one Wednesday evening, speaking through a translator, though many prisoners now understood English well enough to follow along. "The idea that human beings are born with certain inherent rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that governments don't grant but merely recognize and protect." Klaus, who attended these sessions primarily to monitor for subversive content, spoke up immediately. "This is individualistic fantasy. Rights come from the state. The state defines what individuals may do. Without the state, there are no rights, only chaos." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "That's certainly one theory of governance. The organic state theory, that individuals exist to serve the collective, and the state embodies that collective will. But let me ask you, who decides what the collective will is?" "The leader," Klaus answered immediately. "The Führer understands what the German people need. And if the leader is wrong, if the leader pursues policies that harm the people, the leader cannot be wrong. He embodies the will of the folk." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. "Interesting. So there's no mechanism for correction. No way to change course if the chosen direction leads to disaster. In a democracy, by contrast, leaders can be voted out. Policies can be challenged and changed. It's messy and slow, but it allows for course correction without requiring revolution or collapse." Friedrich watched the exchange carefully. Mitchell was not telling them what to think. He was asking questions, exposing logical inconsistencies, inviting them to examine their own assumptions. It was far more effective than propaganda would have been. After the session, Friedrich walked back to the barracks with Ernst, who was unusually quiet. "You're thinking," Friedrich observed. "I'm realizing how much we don't know," Ernst said quietly. "I grew up in a village in Bavaria. I went to school, joined the Hitler Youth, got conscripted. Everything I learned about the world came from sources controlled by the regime. And now I'm sitting in a prison camp in Mississippi, and an American professor is asking me questions I've never considered. And I don't have good answers. That troubles you?" "It terrifies me," Ernst admitted. "Because if they lied about America, about democracy, about racial inferiority, about our inevitable victory, then what else did they lie about? The Jews? The Slavs? The reasons for the war itself?" Friedrich had no answer, because he was asking himself the same questions. December 1943 brought the first letters from home that had not been written before Friedrich's capture. His wife Greta wrote from Dusseldorf, and her words carried the weight of a Germany he barely recognized. "Dearest Friedrich, the bombing continues almost nightly. The British come after dark, the Americans during the day. We spend more time in the cellar than in our apartment. Food is scarce. We are down to 1,800 calories per day, and much of what we receive is turnip and potato. There is no meat, little bread, no coffee or sugar. The children ask about you constantly. Maria understands you are away. Carl is too young to remember your face. Everyone is tired. The propaganda speaks of secret weapons and final victory, but people whisper that we are losing. The Gestapo arrested the Müllers last week. Someone reported that Herr Müller said the war was lost. They took the whole family. No one knows where. I tell the children you will come home when the war ends. I pray this is true. I pray you are safe. I pray this nightmare ends before we have nothing left. Your loving wife, Greta. Friedrich read the letter 3 times, then sat on his bunk staring at nothing. While his family starved in a bombed-out German city, terrified of speaking their true thoughts, he ate 3 meals a day in Mississippi and attended voluntary political theory classes. The irony was devastating. The contrast unbearable. Ernst sat down beside him. News from home? Friedrich handed him the letter. Ernst read it silently, his face growing pale. My parents' last letter was similar, Ernst said quietly. The rations are killing people. Not quickly like bombs, but slowly. Starvation, disease, exhaustion. And the fear. Everyone is afraid all the time. Afraid of the Gestapo, afraid of bombs, afraid to speak, afraid to even think the wrong thoughts. We have to go back, Friedrich said. When this war ends, we have to go back and help rebuild. But rebuild into what? Another dictatorship? Another disaster waiting to happen? No, Ernst said firmly. We rebuild into something like this. He gestured around the barracks, toward the camp beyond. Not perfect. We've seen the problems here. The racial discrimination, the inequality, but a system where people can speak freely, where leaders can be questioned, where workers can strike and families can criticize the government without disappearing in the night. Klaus Hoffmann appeared in the doorway, his expression dark. I heard what you said. Dietrich, you want to turn Germany into America? You want to betray everything our fathers fought for? Ernst stood up, facing Klaus directly. My father fought in the last war. He came home to a Germany destroyed by imperial ambitions and militarism. He voted for Hitler because Hitler promised to restore German pride and prosperity. And what did we get? Another war, more destruction, families starving while party officials live comfortably. You call it betrayal to want something different? I call it learning from catastrophic mistakes. The tension in the barracks was thick enough to cut. Other prisoners had stopped what they were doing, watching the confrontation. Friedrich stood, positioning himself between Klaus and Ernst. Enough. We're all prisoners here. We're all watching our country be destroyed from thousands of miles away. We don't have to agree about what comes after, but we can't turn on each other now. Klaus stared at Friedrich for a long moment, then turned and walked away without speaking. But the divide in the camp was becoming clearer. Some prisoners clung desperately to Nazi ideology, defending beliefs that daily reality contradicted. Others were opening themselves to new possibilities, painful as that opening was. The camp Christmas celebration in 1943 was unlike anything Friedrich expected. The Americans provided materials for the prisoners to build decorations, organize concerts, even perform a nativity play. German prisoners led their own worship services, Catholic, Protestant, even a small Jewish service for the handful of Jews who had been forced into Wehrmacht service and were now separated from their captors. On Christmas Eve, Colonel Whitmore addressed the entire camp. Gentlemen, I know this is a difficult time to be far from home. Many of you have families you miss desperately. But I want you to know that we see you not as monsters or enemies, but as soldiers who served their country and are now protected under international law. When this war ends, you will return home. What kind of Germany you return to is yet to be determined. But I hope that your time here has shown you that democracy, for all its flaws, offers something that tyranny cannot. The freedom to change, to improve, to correct mistakes without requiring the complete destruction of society. The speech was translated carefully, and Friedrich watched the reactions around him. Some men looked angry, offended by the implication that Germany needed lessons from America. Others looked thoughtful, and some, like Ernst, looked almost hopeful. as if permission had been granted to imagine a different future. After the formal observances, Lieutenant Muller gathered his trusted group of officers. "We need to start preparing for what comes after," he said quietly. "The war is not going well for Germany. We all know this, even if we cannot say it openly. When Germany falls, and it will fall, we will be among the first Germans to return home. We will have seen how democracy works in practice, messy and imperfect but functional. We need to be ready to use that knowledge." "You're talking about collaboration," Klaus said from the shadows. He had been listening. "You're talking about helping the Americans remake Germany in their image." "No," Friedrich said carefully. "I'm talking about helping Germans rebuild Germany into something that doesn't lead us to ruin every generation. If that means learning from how other nations organize themselves, then yes, we should learn. Our children deserve better than what we gave them." Klaus stepped forward into the lamplight, his face hard. "You've all been corrupted, seduced by comfort and propaganda. But I will remember. When we return home, I will remember who stayed loyal and who betrayed everything we fought for." "Klaus," Muller said gently, "what did we fight for? Really? Be honest with yourself. Did we fight for Germany's survival? Or for Hitler's ambitions? For our families' futures? Or for a racial ideology that justified atrocities? Because if we fought for the wrong things, then learning better is not betrayal. It's wisdom." Klaus left without answering, but his departure felt significant. The camp was dividing into factions. Those who clung to Nazi ideology despite all evidence, those who cautiously questioned, and those who actively embraced the possibility of democratic reconstruction. Friedrich understood that this division would shape Germany's post-war future. When they returned home, and he believed they would return, they would carry these American experiences with them. Some would use them to help build something new. Others would fight to resurrect the old. The question was, which group would prevail? As 1944 began, the pace of change accelerated. More prisoners arrived from the Italian campaign and from the fighting in France following D-Day. They brought news of Germany's deteriorating military situation, the Eastern Front collapsing, Allied forces advancing through Italy, the constant aerial bombardment destroying German cities and infrastructure. But they also brought something else, a desperate hunger for the stability and abundance that earlier prisoners had learned to expect. The new arrivals went through the same shock Friedrich had experienced. The meals, the medical care, the freedoms, the sheer overwhelming evidence that everything they had been told about American weakness was a lie. Friedrich found himself serving as an informal orientation counselor for new prisoners, helping them navigate the cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda and American reality. He watched them go through the same stages he had experienced: denial, confusion, anger, questioning, and eventually, for many, a painful acceptance that they had been systematically deceived. One evening in February 1944, a newly arrived captain named Werner Stolz sought out Friedrich. Stolz had been captured after the Anzio landings, and his eyes still held the 1,000-yard stare of recent combat. "They told us you had gone soft," Stolz said without preamble, "that the prisoners here had been corrupted by American luxury. But Hauptmann, I have to ask you, is any of this real? The food, the newspapers, the classes, or is it an elaborate deception?" Friedrich gestured for Stolz to sit. "It's real. All of it. And yes, it will make you question everything you believed. That's not corruption, that's information. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you want to face reality or cling to comfortable lies." "I have family in Hamburg," Stolz said quietly. "My wife's last letter said the city is rubble. She takes the children to bomb shelters every night. They eat once a day, thin soup and black bread. And I sit here eating meat and potatoes and reading newspapers that openly criticize their own government. How is this justice?" "It's not justice," Friedrich agreed. "It's simply how they treat prisoners. According to international law, yes, but also because they have the resources to do so and see no reason to be cruel. And that abundance, that casual plenty, that's what defeated us. Not their soldiers or their tanks, but their ability to fight a global war without their civilians ever missing a meal." Stoltz absorbed this silently. Then, "So what do we do when we go home to the ruins?" "We rebuild," Friedrich said firmly, "but not into what we had before. We've seen what works and what fails. We've seen that democracy, for all its flaws, provides something essential: the ability to change course without destroying the entire society. We've seen that diversity is not weakness, that criticism is not treason, that prosperity doesn't require conquest. When we go home, we use these lessons, and those who refuse to learn them." Friedrich thought about Klaus Hoffmann, about the hardliners who still believed in the Führer and the final victory despite all evidence. They will fight us, and we will have to be stronger than they are, because Germany's future depends on which version wins, the one that learns from mistakes or the one that repeats them. By mid-1944, as Allied forces swept through France and Soviet armies pushed westward, the reality of Germany's impending defeat became undeniable even to the most committed ideologues. The camp's population swelled to over 8,000 prisoners, and the discussions about post-war Germany grew more urgent and more divided. The Americans facilitated these discussions, providing materials on democratic governance, market economics, constitutional law, and civil rights. Not everyone participated. Klaus Hoffmann and his followers boycotted what they called re-education propaganda. But hundreds of prisoners engaged seriously with the materials, understanding that they were being given tools to rebuild their shattered nation. Friedrich attended every session, took detailed notes, and engaged in long debates with Ernst, Müller, and others about what German democracy should look like. They studied the American Constitution, the British parliamentary system, the Swiss federalist model. They discussed mistakes to avoid, the Weimar Republic's weaknesses that had allowed Hitler to seize power legally, the economic instability that had made Germans desperate enough to embrace totalitarianism. One afternoon in August 1944, Dr. Mitchell pulled Friedrich aside after a discussion session. "I've been watching you, Captain Weber. You're taking this seriously, not just going through the motions." "I have a wife and 2 children in Dusseldorf," Friedrich said. "If I survive this war and return home, I want them to grow up in a Germany that doesn't require another generation of soldiers." "That means understanding how to build something better than what we had." Mitchell nodded slowly. "You're going to face resistance from true believers who can't accept that the Nazi project was fundamentally flawed, from people too traumatized by defeat to imagine anything new, from allies who will want to punish Germany rather than help rebuild it. The work you're doing now, the thinking, the planning, the learning, that's preparing you for the hardest battle of all, the battle to build peace." Friedrich understood the truth of this. Military defeat was coming. But the ideological struggle, the fight for Germany's soul and future, that was just beginning. And the German prisoners who had spent these years in American camps exposed to democracy in practice would be crucial to determining which future prevailed. As 1944 drew toward its close, Friedrich Weber stood at the fence of Camp Clarksdale, looking out at the Mississippi landscape, and thought about home, about Greta and Maria and Karl surviving in the ruins of Dusseldorf, about the Germany they would rebuild together when this nightmare ended, about the choices he would make and the battles he would fight, not with weapons, but with ideas and institutions and the hard work of convincing a traumatized nation that democracy was worth trying again. The war was ending, but Friedrich's real work was just beginning. May 8th, 1945. The announcement came over the camp radio at 10:00 hours. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Friedrich Weber stood with 8,000 other German prisoners in the Mississippi sun, listening to the news that their nation had been completely defeated, and felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for everything that had been lost, the lives, the cities, the future that might have been if different choices had been made. Around him, reactions varied dramatically. Some men wept openly, others stood in stunned silence. Klaus Hoffmann and his diminished group of true believers remained defiant, insisting that this was temporary, that the Führer had secret plans, that Germany would rise again. But most prisoners simply looked exhausted, as if a terrible weight had finally been lifted even as they contemplated the ruins they would return to. Ernst Dietrich stood beside Friedrich, tears streaming down his face. "It's over," he said quietly. "We lost everything. And for what? What did any of it accomplish?" "It taught us what not to do," Friedrich answered. "That's worth something, if we learn from it." That evening, Colonel Whitmore addressed the entire camp. His words were translated carefully, and Friedrich noticed that the colonel spoke without triumph or mockery, just honest assessment of a difficult situation. "Gentlemen, the war is over. Germany has been defeated. Your nation will now undergo a period of occupation and reconstruction under Allied supervision. This will be difficult. Your cities are destroyed. Your economy is shattered. Many of your families have suffered terribly. But I want you to understand something important. The goal is not vengeance. The goal is to help Germany rebuild into a stable, peaceful, democratic nation that can take its place in the community of nations without requiring another generation of soldiers to die." He paused, letting the translator catch up. "You have spent months or years here observing American democracy in practice. You have seen its strengths and its flaws. You have learned that freedom of speech, rule of law, and democratic institutions provide stability and prosperity in ways that totalitarianism cannot. When you return home, you will be among the first Germans to help rebuild. What you learned here will matter. How you use that knowledge will determine whether your children grow up in peace or prepare for another war." After the announcement, the camp administration accelerated its preparation programs. The repatriation would take months. There were millions of displaced persons to process, and Germany itself was barely functional. But the Americans were determined that returning prisoners would carry democratic principles home with them. Friedrich threw himself into the preparation work with renewed intensity. He attended every available session on constitutional government, on market economics, on civil administration. He studied the mistakes of the Weimar Republic and the American occupation plans for post-war Germany. He took notes obsessively, understanding that he was being given tools that would be desperately needed in the ruins of his homeland. Dr. Mitchell continued his discussion sessions, but now with explicit focus on practical reconstruction. Democracy cannot be imposed from outside, he explained to a group that included Friedrich, Ernst, Müller, and about 40 other engaged prisoners. It has to grow from within, from citizens who understand its principles and value its protections. You gentlemen will be returning to a devastated nation. People will be desperate, traumatized, looking for someone to blame and someone to follow. Your job will be to channel that energy into constructive rebuilding rather than destructive scapegoating. "But how?" asked a young lieutenant named Paul Richter. "How do we convince people who have been taught to hate democracy that it's worth trying again, especially when the democratic Weimar Republic collapsed and led to Hitler?" "By acknowledging its failures," Mitchell responded. "Weimar failed because it was imposed by outside powers, because it couldn't deliver economic stability, because it allowed extremists to manipulate democratic processes to destroy democracy. But those were specific, correctable failures, not inherent flaws in the democratic concept. The question is whether you can build something better, a democracy with stronger constitutional protections, a more stable economic foundation, and a culture that values democratic norms rather than just democratic procedures." Friedrich raised his hand. "Professor, You speak as if we will have choice in how Germany is rebuilt, but the Allies will occupy us. They will make these decisions." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Initially, yes, but occupation cannot last forever. Eventually, Germans will govern Germany again. And when that transition happens, the Germans involved will need to understand how to build and maintain democratic institutions. That's where you come in. You're being trained not to be puppets of the occupation, but to be effective democratic citizens when self-governance returns." The distinction was important. This was not indoctrination designed to create collaborators. It was education designed to create informed citizens. The difference mattered. Throughout the summer and fall of 1945, news from Germany filtered into the camp through letters, newspapers, and official reports. The devastation was almost incomprehensible. Berlin was rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, all reduced to ruins. The economy had collapsed completely. Food was scarce. Infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of refugees were displaced. And everywhere, people struggled simply to survive another day. Friedrich received his first letter from Greta in July. Her handwriting was shaky, and the paper was thin and cheap, probably scavenged from occupation forces. "Dearest Friedrich, we survived. That is all I can say with certainty. The apartment building is mostly rubble, but the cellar is intact, and we live there with 6 other families. The Americans control our sector. The British and French have other parts. The Soviets have the East. The Americans bring food. Not much, but enough to keep us alive. They are not cruel, though many Germans expected worse. Maria is 8 now. She remembers you from the photograph. Karl is 6 and knows you only from my stories. They are hungry all the time. We all are. But the Americans say more food will come as the supply lines improve. When will you come home? The children ask constantly. I tell them soon, though I do not know if this is true. I only know that I need you here. We all need our men back to help rebuild what was destroyed. Your loving wife, Greta." Friedrich read the letter 3 times, then sat down and wrote a response immediately. He told her about the camp, about the education programs, about the plans for democratic reconstruction. He told her that he was learning how to help build a Germany that would never again require their children to become soldiers. He told her that he loved her and the children more than anything, and that everything he was learning here was for them, for their future. But as he wrote, he wondered if Greta would understand. Would a woman who had survived years of bombing and starvation care about constitutional government and democratic principles? Or would she simply want her husband home? Want food and shelter and safety? Want things to return to some kind of normal, regardless of what political system provided it? The question haunted him, because he understood that democracy required more than just institutions and procedures. It required citizens who valued freedom enough to do the hard work of maintaining it. And traumatized, desperate people often chose security over freedom, strong men over democratic debate. In September 1945, the camp received news that made everything suddenly more real. A group of German POWs would be returning home in October as part of the first wave of repatriation. Friedrich was on the list. The news hit him with surprising force. For over 2 years, America had been his home, strange as that was to contemplate. He had adapted to the routines, the abundance, the freedoms. He had learned English fluently. He had studied democratic governance intensively. He had become in some ways more comfortable with American openness than he had been with German regimentation. Now he would return to a Germany he barely recognized, carrying knowledge and experiences that would either be desperately needed or dangerously unwelcome. Lieutenant Mueller gathered the departing prisoners for a final discussion session. About 200 men attended, those who had engaged seriously with the democratic education programs, who understood that they were being sent home not just as returning soldiers, but as potential agents of democratic reconstruction. "Gentlemen," Mueller began, his voice carrying the weight of their shared experience. "We are about to return to a Germany that no longer exists. The nation we left is gone, destroyed by the war we fought and the ideology we served. What replaces it will be determined by the choices we make in the coming months and years." He paused, looking around at the assembled prisoners. "Some of you will want to forget everything you learned here. You will want to return to familiar patterns, to recreate what was comfortable, even if it was destructive. Others will face accusations of collaboration, of being corrupted by the Americans. And all of you will face the daily struggle of surviving in ruins while trying to build something new." Klaus Hoffmann stood up from the back of the room. "You speak as if we should be grateful for our captivity, as if the Americans did us a favor by imprisoning us and filling our heads with their propaganda." Muller met his gaze steadily. "Klaus, I speak as someone who has fought in 2 world wars and seen Germany destroyed twice by militarism and totalitarianism. I speak as someone who has had the opportunity to observe an alternative system that, for all its flaws, does not require systematic wars of conquest to maintain itself. If you see that as propaganda rather than education, then you have learned nothing from our defeat." The tension was thick, but Klaus sat down without further comment. Friedrich understood that this divide, between those who had learned and those who refused to learn, would define Germany's post-war struggles. Ernst Dietrich stood up, his young face serious. "Herr Leutnant, what do we tell people when they ask what it was like here? Do we tell them the truth? That we were fed well, treated fairly, allowed to study and discuss and question? Because that truth will seem like betrayal to many Germans who suffered while we were comfortable." "You tell the truth," Muller said firmly, "because the truth is important. Yes, we were comfortable while our families starved. Yes, we studied democracy while our cities burned. And yes, that contrast is uncomfortable and perhaps unfair. But it also demonstrates something crucial. A democratic nation powerful enough to feed its enemies while fighting a global war is a nation worth learning from. If people call that betrayal, you remind them that blind loyalty to destructive ideologies is what destroyed Germany in the first place." Friedrich's departure from Camp Clarksdale came on a cool October morning. He had packed his few belongings, the notebooks filled with his studies, letters from Greta, a small English-German dictionary, and the identification papers that would allow him to travel through occupied Germany. Dr. Mitchell met him at the camp entrance before the buses arrived. "Captain Weber, I've taught hundreds of German prisoners over the past 2 years. Many listened politely but learned nothing. Others absorbed the information but will never use it. But you understood that this wasn't just academic exercise. You understood that ideas have consequences and that the ideas you carry home will matter." "I don't know if I'll be able to use what I learned," Friedrich admitted. "Germany is chaos. People are desperate. Democracy seems like a luxury when you're trying to find food for your children." "Democracy is never a luxury," Mitchell corrected gently. "It's a foundation. Without it, you're always one crisis away from tyranny. The work you're going home to do, helping rebuild democratic institutions, teaching others what you've learned, modeling democratic citizenship, that work is more important than any military service you performed, because this time you'll be fighting for something worth building rather than something worth destroying." They shook hands, and Friedrich climbed onto the bus that would take him to the port, then to a ship, then home to Germany. As the camp disappeared behind them, he thought about everything he was carrying home, not just in his notebooks, but in his understanding of how societies could organize themselves, how freedoms could coexist with order, how democracy could provide stability without requiring totalitarian control. The journey home took 3 weeks. The ship crossed the Atlantic in convoy, then docked at Bremerhaven, where American occupation forces processed the returning prisoners. Friedrich saw Germany for the first time in over 2 years, and the devastation took his breath away. Bremerhaven was rubble. Buildings reduced to broken walls and collapsed roofs, infrastructure destroyed, people moving through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing whatever clothes they could scavenge. This was not the Germany he had left, prosperous, organized, confident in its destiny. This was the Germany that totalitarianism had created, destroyed, occupied, starting from zero. The trip from Bremerhaven to Düsseldorf took 2 days on trains that barely functioned, through landscapes scarred by bombing and fighting. Every city they passed through was ruins. Every bridge had been destroyed and rebuilt as temporary structures. Every factory was a skeleton of twisted metal. When Friedrich finally reached Düsseldorf in early November, he stood at what had been the central train station, now a partially collapsed ruin, and tried to orient himself. The city he had known was gone. The streets he had walked were rubble-filled canyons. The apartment building where he had lived with Greta was a pile of broken masonry. He found her through the occupation authorities, who maintained lists of survivors and their locations. She was living in the cellar of a partially collapsed building with Maria, Karl, and 3 other families. When Friedrich descended the stairs into the dim, crowded space, Greta looked up from the thin soup she was stirring over a makeshift stove, and her face transformed. "Friedrich," she whispered, "Friedrich." They held each other for a long time, while Maria and Karl watched shyly from the corner. Karl, who had been 2 when Friedrich was captured, did not recognize him. Maria remembered, but barely. He was more photograph than father to her. But they were alive. His family had survived. That was more than many Germans could say. That first night, sleeping on a thin mattress in a cold cellar, listening to his children breathe in the darkness, Friedrich understood the enormity of the task ahead. These people, starving, traumatized, desperate, needed food and shelter and security before they would care about democracy or freedom or constitutional government. The question was whether he could help provide both the immediate necessities and the long-term foundation for something better. Over the following months, Friedrich worked with the American occupation authorities and with other returning POWs who had received similar education. They helped organize local governance structures, established community councils, worked on food distribution, and began the slow process of rebuilding not just buildings, but institutions. The work was frustrating and difficult. Many Germans were too traumatized to care about political philosophy. They just wanted to survive. Others were resentful of the occupation and suspicious of anyone who cooperated with American authorities. And some, like Klaus Hoffmann, who had returned to his hometown in Bavaria, actively worked to resurrect Nazi networks and undermine democratic reconstruction. But slowly, painfully, progress emerged. Town councils were established with elected representatives. Courts began operating under rule of law rather than arbitrary power. Schools reopened with curriculums that taught critical thinking rather than propaganda. Newspapers began publishing that could criticize authorities without editors being arrested. Friedrich found himself working as a liaison between the American occupation forces and German civilian authorities. His English fluency and his understanding of both cultures made him valuable in bridging the gap between occupiers and occupied. He helped translate not just words but concepts, explaining to Americans why Germans were suspicious of democracy after Weimar's collapse, explaining to Germans why democratic processes mattered even when they seemed inefficient compared to authoritarian decisiveness. Ernst Dietrich settled in Hamburg, where he worked with youth programs, trying to provide young Germans with alternatives to the totalitarian indoctrination they had received. He drew on his own experience, raised in the Hitler Youth, sent to war before he understood what he was fighting for, captured and exposed to a different way of thinking, to help teenagers navigate the ideological chaos of post-war Germany. Lieutenant Müller became an advisor to the state government in Bavaria, helping draft constitutional provisions that would prevent the kind of democratic collapse that had enabled Hitler's rise. He insisted on strong protections for minority rights, checks on executive power, and education requirements for citizens to understand their democratic responsibilities. The turning point came in 1948-49, when the American, British, and French occupation zones began preparing for the establishment of a new German state, the Federal Republic of Germany. The Constitutional Convention brought together Germans from across the Western zones to draft a founding document for the new nation. Friedrich attended as an observer and occasional consultant. He watched as Germans who had been educated in democratic principles during occupation, many of them former POWs like himself, debated the structure of the new government with passion and sophistication. They studied the American Constitution, the British parliamentary system, the Swiss federalist model. They identified weaknesses in the Weimar Constitution that had allowed Hitler to seize power legally. They built in protections against extremism, checks on executive power, guarantees of human rights that could not be suspended even in emergencies. The basic law, Grundgesetz, that emerged was not perfect. It was a compromise document, reflecting disagreements about federalism, about economic systems, about the relationship between church and state. But it was fundamentally democratic, built on principles that Friedrich had first encountered in that Mississippi prison camp: rule of law, protection of individual rights, separation of powers, democratic accountability. When the Federal Republic was formally established in May 1949, Friedrich stood in the crowd at the ceremony and felt something he had not felt in years: hope. Not naive hope that ignored the enormous challenges ahead, the division of Germany, the poverty, the trauma, the persistent networks of unrepentant Nazis, but realistic hope that this time, perhaps, Germany had learned from its catastrophic mistakes. The 1950s brought both progress and challenges. The Marshall Plan pumped resources into Western Europe, helping rebuild economies and infrastructure. The economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, transformed West Germany from ruins to prosperity with remarkable speed. Democratic institutions strengthened as people gained confidence in their stability and effectiveness. But the ideological struggle continued. Klaus Hoffmann and others like him worked to keep Nazi ideology alive, operating through cultural organizations and political parties that tested the boundaries of what the new democracy would tolerate. The government banned the most explicitly Nazi parties, but struggled with how to address the millions of former party members and supporters who remained part of German society. Friedrich found himself often called upon to explain why democracy required tolerating views one disagreed with, even views that were repugnant. It was one of the hardest lessons to convey, that the strength of democracy lay not in silencing opposition, but in winning arguments through better ideas and evidence. He told audiences about his experience in Mississippi, about watching Americans argue passionately about politics without violence, about seeing workers strike during wartime and eventually return to work after negotiation. He explained that democracy was messy and inefficient precisely because it allowed all voices to be heard, but that this messiness prevented the kind of catastrophic errors that came from totalitarian certainty. Not everyone was convinced. Some Germans remained nostalgic for the order and clarity of authoritarianism, for the sense of national purpose that Hitler had provided even as he drove the nation to destruction. But gradually, a generation emerged that had known only democracy, that took constitutional rights for granted, that expected to be able to criticize their government without fear. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy visited West Germany and gave a famous speech in Berlin declaring, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. Friedrich watched the speech on television with Greta, Maria, and Karl. Maria was now 26, a teacher helping educate the next generation in democratic values. Karl was 24, an engineer helping rebuild German infrastructure. Both had grown up in a democratic Germany and could barely remember the authoritarian nightmare their parents had lived through. "Did you ever think we would see this?" Greta asked quietly as Kennedy's motorcade moved through cheering crowds. An American president speaking in Berlin and Germans celebrating him as an ally? Friedrich shook his head slowly. When I was captured in Tunisia, I expected to be starved and tortured. Instead, I was fed better than German soldiers in the field. I was taught about democracy in discussion groups. I was given tools to help rebuild Germany after the war. If someone had told me then that 20 years later, American presidents would be heroes in Berlin, I would have thought they were insane. But it happened, Maria observed. The alliance happened. The reconstruction happened. Democracy happened. Why? Friedrich considered the question carefully. Because the Americans understood something crucial. You cannot defeat an ideology through military force alone. You have to provide a better alternative. They could have treated us as enemies to be punished, and some Germans would have deserved that punishment. But instead, they treated us as potential citizens of a democratic future. They exposed us to freedom and trusted that exposure to do what propaganda could not. Change minds through lived experience rather than coercion. He paused, remembering those discussions with Dr. Mitchell, those long afternoons picking cotton alongside Mabel, who explained that democracy meant freedom to complain about what wasn't working. I learned more about democracy by living in an American POW camp than I could have learned from 1,000 lectures. I saw it function. I saw its flaws and its strengths. I saw that it was messy and inefficient, but ultimately more stable and prosperous than totalitarianism. And when I came home, I carried that knowledge with me. Karl spoke up. But it could have gone differently. If the occupation had been purely punitive, if returning prisoners had been treated as collaborators, if the Allies had tried to impose democracy by force rather than by education and example, would it have worked? No, Friedrich said with certainty. Democracy cannot be imposed. It has to be chosen by citizens who understand its value and are willing to do the work of maintaining it. The Americans' genius was not in telling us how to run our country, but in showing us alternatives and letting us decide what to adopt. By the 1970s, West Germany had become a stable, prosperous democracy and a key American ally. The generation that had fought the war was aging, and younger Germans who had known only peace and democracy were taking leadership positions. The questions that had obsessed Friedrich's generation, about how to build democratic institutions, about how to prevent another totalitarian takeover, about how to balance freedom and order, had been largely answered through practice and experience. Friedrich retired in 1974 at the age of 62. He had spent nearly 3 decades working on democratic reconstruction in various capacities, as a government liaison, as an educator, as an advisor on constitutional matters. He had seen Germany transform from ruins to prosperity, from occupation to sovereignty, from authoritarian traditions to democratic norms. At his retirement dinner, attended by colleagues from both German government and American occupation authority veterans, someone asked him what he considered his greatest contribution to post-war Germany. Friedrich thought for a long moment. "I told the truth," he said finally. "When Germans asked what it was like in American POW camps, I told them the truth, that we were treated humanely, that we were exposed to democratic ideas, that we saw abundance and freedom that contradicted everything we had been taught. Some people called me a collaborator for admitting this, but that truth mattered, because it demonstrated that democracy was not just Allied propaganda, but a functioning alternative to totalitarianism." He paused, looking around at the assembled guests. "Many of you in this room are former POWs who had similar experiences. We came home carrying knowledge that was desperately needed but sometimes dangerously unwelcome. We helped build democratic institutions not because Americans forced us to, but because we had seen them work and understood their value. That's the gift that American treatment of prisoners gave Germany. Not occupation or coercion, but education and example." Friedrich Weber died in 1989 at the age of 77, just months before the Berlin Wall fell and Germany began its journey toward reunification. He did not live to see the final chapter of the story that began with his capture in Tunisia in 1943, but he had contributed to writing it. At his funeral, attended by family, friends, and colleagues from decades of democratic work, Ernst Dietrich gave a brief eulogy. Ernst was now in his 60s, a retired educator who had spent his career helping young Germans understand democratic citizenship. Friedrich once told me that the most important thing he learned in that Mississippi prison camp was that democracy required active participation, not passive obedience, Ernst said. He understood that building and maintaining free societies was harder than submitting to authoritarian control, but that the difficulty was worth it because freedom allowed for correction and improvement in ways that totalitarianism could not. He paused, looking at Friedrich's children and grandchildren. Those of us who were captured and exposed to American democracy during the war carried that exposure home. We were among the first Germans to see that alternatives to totalitarianism were not just possible, but preferable. We became teachers, administrators, politicians, and citizens who understood that democracy was not a gift from outside powers, but a practice that required constant work and vigilance. Friedrich devoted his life to that work, and the Germany his grandchildren inherit, free, prosperous, democratic, is his legacy. The story of German POWs in American camps is often overlooked in histories of World War II, overshadowed by combat operations and Holocaust revelations and the drama of military occupation. But it represents something profound about how democracies can confront ideological enemies, not just through military force, but through sustained exposure to democratic practice. Over 425,000 German prisoners were held in the United States during World War II, housed in more than 700 camps across the country. They lived in American communities, worked alongside American civilians, observed American democracy in its messy, chaotic, imperfect reality. They saw abundance that contradicted propaganda about democratic weakness. They saw diversity that contradicted racial theories. They saw freedom that contradicted totalitarian certainty. Not all were convinced. Some remained committed Nazis who returned to Germany determined to resurrect the ideology that had destroyed their nation. But many experienced the same transformation as Friedrich Weber, a gradual erosion of certainty, replaced by questions and observations and the slow, uncomfortable realization that everything they had been taught was either incomplete or deliberately false. These men returned home to a devastated Germany and became part of the democratic reconstruction. They served in local governments, taught in schools, worked in courts and administrative offices, and helped establish institutions that would prevent another totalitarian takeover. Their experience of American democracy, not as abstract theory but as lived practice, informed their understanding of how democratic societies functioned and what made them stable. The success of post-war German democracy was not inevitable. It required sustained effort from multiple sources. The Marshall Plan's economic support, the occupation authorities' commitment to democratic reconstruction, the German people's willingness to confront their past and build something new. But the German POWs who had spent the war years in American camps played a crucial role in that reconstruction. They carried knowledge that could not have been gained any other way, the knowledge of what democracy looked like from the inside, with all its strengths and flaws and capacity for self-correction. This is the untold story of how democracies can defeat totalitarian ideologies, not just through military victory, but through patient exposure to alternatives, not through propaganda, but through lived experience, not through coercion, but through education and example. Friedrich Weber's journey from proud Wehrmacht officer to democratic educator embodies that transformation. His experience in Camp Clarksdale, Mississippi, did not erase his German identity or make him an American puppet. Instead, it gave him tools to help build a better Germany, one that could acknowledge its catastrophic mistakes, learn from them, and construct institutions designed to prevent their repetition. The meal that shocked him on his first day, the meatloaf and mashed potatoes and apple pie, was not just food. It was evidence that challenged everything he believed about American weakness and democratic instability. The cotton fields where he worked alongside Mabel, who explained that democracy meant freedom to criticize what wasn't working. That was education in democratic practice more powerful than any lecture. The discussion groups with Dr. Mitchell that used questions rather than directives, that respected his intelligence while challenging his assumptions, that was how democratic citizenship was taught and learned. And the cumulative effect of thousands of such moments, multiplied across thousands of prisoners over years of captivity, created a core of Germans who returned home with both the understanding and the commitment to help build democratic institutions that have now lasted more than 75 years. This is the legacy of treating enemies with dignity, of respecting international law even when expedience might suggest otherwise, of understanding that long-term peace requires not just military victory, but ideological transformation. The Americans who ran those POW camps, who fed German prisoners while American families rationed, who taught democratic principles to men who had fought to destroy democracy. They were conducting an experiment in whether exposure to freedom could achieve what force alone could not. The experiment succeeded. Not perfectly, not completely, but substantially enough to transform Germany from America's enemy into one of its strongest allies, from a totalitarian nightmare into a stable democracy, from a source of global conflict into a pillar of European peace and prosperity. And it began with something as simple as a meal, a conversation, a moment of recognizing shared humanity across the divide of war. From that recognition, everything else became possible.